Hi and welcome. So this week, one of our topics that we're going to be thinking about is disability, and as it relates to principles of beneficence that we've been thinking about in the context of this course. We'll remember that the principle of beneficence is one of the big principles in healthcare, and it tells us that we need to be doing things as healthcare providers that enhance the quality of people's lives, right? If we really did believe that medicine did nothing to enhance the quality of people's lives, there wouldn't seem to be much of a point in having hospitals. Part of what gets interesting here is once we actually start thinking about what beneficence is and what it is to benefit somebody, it gets really complicated quickly. And I think that one of the ways in which that can be especially illuminated in its philosophical richness and complication is the topic of disability. So my plan for this video is to give you a brief overview of two papers. The first one is a paper co-authored by Julian Savulescu and Guy Kahane called The Moral Obligation to Create Children with the Best Chance of the Best Life. There's Savulescu and Kahane. And then we're going to see something that might function as something of a rebuttal to that paper in this interesting paper by Adrian Asch. Asch was a scholar of disability theory and also an activist in disability rights. So we're going to get two perspectives on how to think about how medicine relates to issues related to disability. So let's just dive right in. In the paper by Savulescu and Kahane, they are basically saying when it comes to disabilities, we want to think about a disability as something that makes your life harder, right? So for instance, if you are blind, that is a state of having less ability than somebody else, and also it's having less ability in a way that makes your life more difficult, right? Now, in the context of Savulescu and Kahane's paper, they're going to give us a principle, right? So they're going to say when you are procreating, you might have certain moral obligations that come along with questions of harm and benefit. So they call this the principle of procreative beneficence, and sometimes in the paper they just refer to it as PB, principle of beneficence, as it comes to procreation, or procreative beneficence. So they say here, if couples or single reproducers have decided to have a child and selection is possible, then they have a significant moral reason to select the child or possible children that they could have, whose life can be expected, in light of the relevant available information, to go best, or at least not worse, than any of the others. So the thought here is, look, we have new technology when it comes to reproductive medicine. One way to make a baby is the old-fashioned way, but you probably also know that there are a bunch of technologies that can be brought into the mix as well. So for instance, you can screen the genetic profile of a fetus, and if there is something problematic to the parent in that genetic profile, they could choose to abort. And this does happen in our society. Some people will, for instance, choose to abort a pregnancy if they find that that pregnancy is a pregnancy with Down syndrome. And the thought here is that maybe the principle of procreative beneficence would apply to that case. So if you believed that your potential child would have a better life if they were a child without Down syndrome rather than with, then that would be a reason to select against the Down syndrome child and select for the child that does not carry the extra chromosome. Now, if you don't like that one example, and many people wouldn't like that example as it applies to PB. They might say, for instance, that actually people with Down syndrome have just as good of a chance of having a great life as compared to somebody without the gene. And we might be open-minded to that, Well, Savulescu and Kahane could give us other possible applications of the principle of procreative beneficence. So, for instance, it's possible that we could one day screen your potential children for having the gene for depression, right? We might think, look, if you think that having the gene for depression makes it more likely that you won't be expected to have the best life possible, then you should select against depression and for lacking that gene. Or just to take one more example, sickle cell anemia. If you reasonably expect that a child without sickle cell disease is going to have a life that goes the best as compared to the one that doesn't have sickle cell disease, then it would make sense to use perhaps prenatal screening, that is, test for the gene and abort. Or we could also use tests where we actually, before there's even fertilization, right? So we can test the genetic profile of specific sperm cells or specific egg cells. Right? So we would think like, look, if you think that sickle cell disease has a good chance of making your life go worse, or a genetic profile without sickle cell disease has the best chance of going best, then you should select for that genetic profile. Now, a couple of things to note. Savulescu and Kahane are saying that this is not the only moral consideration. Just like we learned about how the 4 principles of medical ethics are what we call prima facie principles. That means that they speak in favor of acting in certain ways, but unless we have all the information, the principle might or might not lead to your all things considered duties. Right? So it says it's something that we have significant reason to aim for, but not that we always have to select. We might also notice that some couples might not be able to afford things like pre-implantation diagnosis or prenatal screening, right? Another thing that we notice here is that Savulescu and Kahane are giving us a principle of expected benefit. That is, it's a principle that says, look, you should do the thing that has the best chance of going the best, because we might know that, look, one person could have what we might think of as a completely clean genetic test, but for any number of reasons, their life could go terribly. We could imagine somebody else, say with Down syndrome or with sickle cell disease, who, in spite of these perhaps worrisome genetic aspects to their genome, we might also say, on the other hand, that, through some good luck and maybe some good support, that person could still have a great life. Well, what Savulescu and Kahane are saying here is you still want to set a potential child up for the best possible life that you can. Now, maybe you find this principle intuitive just straightforwardly, or maybe you're not convinced by the principle. But remember, in philosophy, we don't just state conclusions, or at least when we're doing philosophy well, we don't just state conclusions, but we also look for reasons. So let's think about some of the reasons that Savulescu and Kahane give us for this principle of procreative beneficence that says if you're going to reproduce, you should use your available technologies to get a child with the best chance of the best life. Well, here's one suggestion. They say it is a moral defect in a person to be indifferent whether your child will live a good life, right? So we recommend against binge drinking during pregnancy, and we think that the reason why it's a bad idea to binge drink during pregnancy is because that is likely to bring about harms. So the thought here is like, look, this is just an extension of some things that you already believe. Here's an example that Savulescu and Kahane give us. They say, imagine you are in a situation where there is a rubella pandemic. And one thing that you might know about rubella is that if a person gets rubella when they are pregnant, that can lead to a bunch of problems for the potential baby. So for instance, if you have rubella while you are pregnant, then the baby could have brain damage, blindness, deafness. And here's how Savulescu and Kahane think about it. If there were a pandemic like this going on, it would make sense for a person wanting to have a child to wait a few months. Until the pandemic is over, they have a very low chance of getting rubella, and they have a very low chance of leaving their future child with these sorts of conditions. Right? So in this way, they say it's common sense that it would be bad to, for instance, bring a child into existence and expose them to the risk of things like brain damage, blindness, and deafness. They also point out that we believe something like PB when we think that it's a good and admirable thing for parents to secure the means for giving their child a happy life before conceiving. So, for instance, we might think that it is a good thing when people wait until they have enough money, secure their careers in the right way, when they're ready to have a kid. We think that's a good thing to do. We might think that that's a further extension of beneficence to one's future child. They also suggest that the reasons to select a child free of rubella are going to be the same kinds of reasons, and they're going to be really strong reasons to cure a child of rubella. And so, for instance, if it's bad for the baby to have rubella and you could cure it with a simple pill, you would have a duty to give that kid that simple pill. Well, if you can prevent your child from having a genetic disease that lowers their quality of life, you should go ahead and use the means to prevent that disease. So these are the kinds of arguments that Savulescu and Kahane are pushing at. Here's the last one. We might think like, look, even your potential child with maybe a certain genetic condition that makes things likely to go a little worse, maybe like a predilection towards depression. They say, look, we have reason to choose what's good, we have more reason to prefer what's better. So even if you think that this child with a predilection to depression has a good chance of living a good life, we still might think it would be best if we bring into existence the child with the best chance of the best, right? So why choose the thing that has a chance of going worse when you could choose the chance of the thing that goes better? Similar reason for, say, why we think it's a good idea to wait until you're ready to have kids to actually do it. Now, what happens in Savulescu and Kahane's paper is they're going to lay out this reasoning in favor of their principle, and often what we do in philosophy then is we then figure out possible objections to a principle and see if we can find ways to block those objections. So here are some of the objections that Savulescu and Kahane look at in their paper. Now, I'm not going to go through every objection and every reply. It's going to be your work to delve into the paper deeper and see if you can get a grip on their responses and see if this is a principle that actually applies in medicine, if it's a good way to think about beneficence. But here are some of the things that they imagine some people might object to them. One objection says it's a mistake to say that people have a moral obligation to select a child with the best chance of the best life. Their response there, for instance, is going to be that they're saying that you've got a strong reason, but say if you cannot afford genetic testing, then they're not necessarily going to say that you have a moral obligation. Some people might say there is no such thing as a better life or a worse life. I'll say something about this objection. I think that there's something to it. We might say, look, one genetic profile is no better or no worse than another genetic profile, and both should be equally admirable into bringing into existence. But Savulescu and Kahane on this principle are just going to say they just don't believe that. Because they think that if you believe that, then there would be nothing wrong with conceiving a child during the rubella pandemic, even though there's this high risk of them having brain damage, deafness, and blindness. The thought would be the reason why we think that there's a problem with taking that kind of risk with your future child is because things like brain damage, deafness, and blindness are actually making the life go worse. There are some other objections. For instance, an objection about how the principle of procreative beneficence is overly demanding. Maybe there's a question about what we should aim at for our children, whether we might think that we're not thinking enough about the autonomy of our future children, that we should instead, back off on our overemphasis on trying to make the child's life go as well as we can, and sort of respect their autonomy by leaving our hands off. And here's a final objection. It says it demeans and trivializes the lives of disabled people. Maybe I'll say a brief thing on that objection. And this is that for Savulescu and Kahane, they don't think that they're saying that a disabled life is more worth living or less worth living, because they're going to say they can still believe that disabled people who actually exist should be respected, should be treated with dignity, and should have their rights taken seriously. But what they are saying is that by bringing a disabled person into existence, that is a creation of a hardship for that disabled person. And if you could bring a disabled person into existence or a non-disabled person into existence, you might reasonably believe that there would be fewer hardships for the non-disabled person, and then you apply the principle of procreative beneficence, according to Savulescu and Kahane, and that's going to justify, selecting against the disability. All right, so we're going to shift to the paper from Asch. Now, Asch's paper really does give us a contrary view. One thing that Asch tells us, and I think that we can put this in direct conversation with Savulescu and Kahane's article, is that she worries sometimes about over-medicalizing things. So she says that there is a common view of disability in our society and in the medical profession, she thinks, that is called the medical view of disability. And the medical view of disability says that having a disability is an inherently problematic thing, and that the goal of medicine should be to eradicate disabilities, or at least reduce their prevalence as much as possible. So for instance, we would think that the point of having medicine would be to bring sight back to as many blind people as we can, or to stop people from passing something like sickle cell disease from their current generation onto their children, right? This medical view of disability sort of says that, look, medicine is in many important ways a technical profession, and disability is a kind of problem that this technical profession can fix. Now, this is the medical view of disability. I think that Asch would attribute it to Savulescu and Kahane. But Asch is mentioning this view, but she's not arguing in favor of it, right? So Asch is going to tell us that there are faulty assumptions built into this medical view of disability. Here's the first faulty assumption that she notices. So the first faulty assumption, according to Asch, is that disabilities are necessarily hardships that forever disrupt a person's quality of life. So the thought here is that being disabled makes you inherently worse off. And here's the second faulty assumption with the medical view of disability. Remember, the medical view of disability says the goal of medicine is to fix or reduce the prevalence of disabilities as much as possible. The second faulty assumption is that the reason why disabled people do have hard lives when they do is the inherent nature of the disability that's creating the hardship. We might sort of notice that it's not society that creates the problems with disability, it's the inherent nature and the way that your body is. So Asch gives us arguments against both of these assumptions. So the first faulty assumption is faulty because, and now we're looking at what Asch is actually asserting, She notes that the levels of happiness in people who are disabled are not significantly different from the happiness levels of able-bodied, or sometimes we'll just say non-disabled people. Right? So we're going to say, for instance, if you actually look at psychological research on how happy a non-disabled person is, and you look at psychological research on how happy a disabled person is, say a blind person or a deaf person, they are going to say that the research says, disabled people say, that they like their lives. So it's quite a strange thing, Asch is going to point out, that we're trying to make it so that there are fewer blind people in the world. When you meet a blind person, oftentimes they will say, basically, I like my life very much. Thank you very much. Here's how Asch puts it. I like this quote, so I worked it into the slides. What is it like to be a person with a disability? Well, it's kind of just what it is like to be a person. Here's what Asch says. What are you thinking about when you have a disability? She says, quote, people with disabilities are thinking about a traffic jam, a disagreement with a friend, which movie to attend, or which team will win the World Series. Not just about their diagnosis. So it's not as if, for instance, if a person is blind, they're just thinking about how much it sucks to be blind all the time, right? In fact, they kind of get used to the fact that they're blind and go on with their lives. Some other psychological research has seemed to bear this out. So you may have heard of studies where people will be disabled suddenly in their life, and we can look at data on how happy they were before the disabling incident. And we will see a low trough in their happiness levels right after they become disabled. But it is a repeated bit of data that suggests that human beings are incredibly resilient. And if a person becomes disabled through an accident, whether they're blinded or deafened, or they become paraplegic, they will become less happy as they adjust to the situation. But they will also, over time, bounce back to similar levels of happiness, even though they don't regain their abilities. Right? And that would seem to suggest that, the levels of happiness in people who are disabled, they're not significantly different from the happiness levels of able-bodied people. But you may have heard many stories about how disabled people have hard things to deal with a lot. And here's the second assumption. Asch is going to agree that there are a lot of things that make a disabled person's life harder, right? Waiting for a bus, and the bus simply ignores them because they don't want to accommodate their disability by stopping and employing the ramp, right? The idea here is that that's not the inherent nature of the disability that's making your life worse. It's actually societal factors that do much of the work explaining why it's hard to have a disability. Asch, in fact, points out that maybe there are some conditions, maybe like sickle cell disease or chronic pain conditions, where it is the inherent nature of the state of your body and your condition that's making your life worse off. But Asch is also going to assert that a great amount of the hardships suffered by disabled people are explained in terms of societal factors. So some of the things that she points to are employment discrimination. It's harder for a person in a wheelchair to get certain jobs, even though they're fully capable of doing the tasks involved with those jobs. We might also know that the way that benefits in the society are set up, it's actually harder to get disability benefits if you have too much money or if you are too gainfully employed, right? And this really puts disabled people into a catch-22, where they realize, well, I would like to work more and like to advance myself in society, but if I do that, then I will lose my Medicaid coverage. I will lose, for instance, funding to wheelchairs and other assistive devices. So this is a really problematic situation where disabled people want to work and they want to contribute to society, but the way that we've built our society makes it hard for these disabled people to actually make a contribution. We might also notice that disability is stigmatized. So, for instance, if you learn about a couple who is about to have a baby and they tell you that that baby is going to have Down syndrome, maybe you might react mainly joyfully and tell them congratulations first. But if you're learning about the pregnancy and the Down syndrome at the same time, but oftentimes when a couple is about to have a Down syndrome baby, people tell them, oh, I'm so sorry. That must be so hard for you. It's just making this assumption that a Down syndrome baby will be less wanted or that it's a tragedy for the family. Sometimes these parents will be sad and upset and worried about this child, but the thought here is that in this situation, we maybe prematurely assume that it's a tragedy for a disabled person to come into existence rather than something that's exciting and joyful, like any other baby. Right. We can also see that sometimes stigma against disability is employed even in medical contexts. So disabled people are more likely to be talked down to or not be taken seriously. Or again, their lives may be talked about in different ways as compared to children without disabilities. So Asch just wants to press a few corrections against myths about disability. One is that we cannot simply eradicate disability. This is a problem that medicine will never fully fix. At least not through genetic testing, because genetic testing will predict some disabilities, but many disabilities cannot be predicted through genetic testing because the testing is not good enough. There are also many cases where it cannot be predicted through genetic testing because some disabilities are caused by things like accidents or sicknesses later in life. And we might also notice that the cost of caring for disabled people would not be eliminated through genetic testing. Again, this is because we would remove a certain amount of disability from this world if we used genetic testing as aggressively as we could. But, for instance, somebody like Judith Heumann, if you watch the documentary Crip Camp, you'll learn about all the work that she did as a disability rights activist in the 1970s and onward. She was instrumental in getting the Americans with Disabilities Act passed. But Judith Heumann became unable to walk because she had polio as a child. This will not be eliminated through genetic testing, for instance. And so we might realize that this medical view of disability, which tries to reduce the prevalence of disability as much as possible, we can't, for instance, imagine a perfect world in which no disabled people exist. Even if you are not disabled right now, you might become disabled at some point in your life. You might have certain mobility issues and need a wheelchair, or you might become blind, you might become deaf. And insofar as, people, a certain proportion of the population will always need wheelchairs, we're always going to need ramps into City Hall, for instance. Another common stereotype you hear about disabled people, and maybe a reason why a person would not want to have a disabled child, is because there's this thought that, you want your children to be contributors to society rather than takers. But as Asch points out in her paper, disabled people contribute to society in significant ways. So, for instance, people like Judith Heumann were able to do great work. There are other people in that documentary Crip Camp. They have pretty serious disabilities, but they are also able to work, contribute to society, parent their children, and so forth. We might also notice that parents of children with disabilities do not necessarily have worse lives. So Asch looks at some research about parents of children with cystic fibrosis, which again is a pretty scary condition for children to have. The technology is getting better, so people with CF are living longer and longer in their lives. But it is a condition that requires serious levels of treatment. This might speak to the resilience of people again. Parents of children with disabilities like CF have in some cases been reported to have similar levels of stress as compared to parents of non-disabled children. Of course, it might be stressful to have a disabled child, but that's partly because it's stressful to have any kind of child. Asch even points out there are special stresses that come along with having a gifted child, right? Say an Olympic level athlete or a genius level piano player. Well, there are all sorts of stresses and work and reorientations of your life that happen there. And so Asch seems to suggest that it would be unfair to simply point to the stresses that come along with having a disabled child. Maybe her point, we might realize, is that there are stresses that come along with all versions of parenting. So that's a gist of the arguments we find in these two papers. Here are some questions that I think that these papers leave us with. What assumptions do we make in medicine when we act according to duties of beneficence? Different people will have different ideas of what it is to live a good and happy life. And we might ask and wonder, well, can we be open-minded about what it is to live a good life? And does that open-minded view mean that we have to, for instance, not have a bias against bringing disabled lives into existence rather than non-disabled lives? Or we might, with Savulescu and Kahane, think that it just makes sense to think that something about blindness itself makes a life harder, and we do our child a benefit by bringing them into existence sighted rather than bringing into existence some other child that does have blindness. We can think more deeply about this point that Asch made. What prejudices in society do we find against people with disabilities? And which hardships of disabled people can be explained simply in terms of society rather than the inherent nature of the disability? Yet, we might also ask whether there are significant aspects of disability that can be explained in terms of those disabilities' inherent nature. So we might think about something like a chronic pain condition or sickle cell disease as instances where it's the inherent nature of the disability that is simply painful. And it's not just that having sickle cell disease makes it hard to do certain things or less able to do certain things, but it's actually bringing pain to your life, right? I think the last thing we need to reflect on is what are the duties of the healthcare profession when we start to think about principles of beneficence as they relate to disability. Right? So we might start to ask questions about how can the healthcare profession serve disabled people and maybe the parents of disabled people better. Asch makes some suggestions like giving equivalent levels of information about support, not only for parents who have, say, a child with Down syndrome, but to parents who have learned that they're about to have a child with Down syndrome. So they would want to make sure that we're giving full and complete information, not only to families with disabled children, but also to families that might have disabled children or about to. We can also ask a question about, well, if we explain so much of the problems that disabled people go through in society is based on prejudice, what responsibilities do healthcare workers have to fight against those prejudices? On the one hand, we might think that encouraging parents to maybe bring a child into existence even though they might be disabled would be a way of fighting against those prejudices. But on the other hand, some parents just cannot imagine having a child with Down syndrome and would choose to abort. Now, on the one hand, we might think that that perpetuates discrimination against disabled people. On the other hand, we might think that the role of the healthcare professional is not to fight these societal biases, perhaps maybe especially when a potential parent might have a strong preference to have a non-disabled child as opposed to a disabled child. Right? So the extent to which healthcare professionals allow for screening against disabilities, we might start to reflect as to whether that's a good thing because it respects the autonomy of parents, or whether it's a bad thing because it represents a certain perpetuation of anti-disability prejudices, that is, ableist prejudices, whether it violates the rights of these potential disabled people. So these are not easy questions, but they are questions that I encourage you and invite you to reflect on more deeply. One way that you can do that is with the writing assignment based around the documentary Crip Camp. So you might look into the ways in which disability make lives harder for people like Judith Heumann, who was in that documentary. But you might also consider all the ways in which Asch would point out that people with disabilities have something genuine to contribute, and many of their hardships are explained in terms of societal discrimination. All right, well, thanks for listening in today. And as always, I look forward to seeing you think these views through. If you have any questions or concerns for me, please don't hesitate to reach out. All right, take care. Thanks.